Um, First off, I think a thanks to ASPO. They've put together an absolutely wonderful, stimulating, absolutely mind-blowing event. Thanks to all of the presenters for what has been an absolutely stimulating and informative conversation. I was asked to kind of summarize the day's events and the insights that we've had. And I want to preface that by talking a little bit about, I'm teaching a class this semester at Colorado State called Energy Policy in Our Future. And in that class, we talk about the peak oil problem. We talk about the various alternatives. We talk about the various policy solutions. We talk about climate change. We talk about the many factors, the myriad factors that interact and that we're going to face in our future. And so today has been not just about problems, and the speakers talking about, it hasn't been just about problems, but it's been about solutions. It's been about paths. It's been about thinking about how we can best address what's coming. Everyone in this room is likely a long-term, paradigmatic, systemic thinker. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. You have self-selected yourself into this room. You chose to be here to learn. The people outside of that room, or outside of this room, are slightly different. They're not here. They're not experiencing this wonderful event. But they're also not necessarily presented with the information that you have. And that's one of the pieces I want to bring up. Because what have we heard today? What are the people outside this room missing? Well, we've heard today about uncertainty. We've heard about going backwards. We've heard about conservation. We've heard about going without. We've heard lives are going to change, but we don't know how. There are a lot of smart people, and I think evidenced by today, there are a lot of smart people thinking about technological and policy solutions, thinking long-term about this resource-constrained environment that we're coming upon. But, and I think this is another thing that was relatively a consensus today, that until a stimulus occurs, until that tipping point, whatever phrase you want to borrow, policy is going to progress slowly. It's going to progress in a bottom-up fashion, whether it's going to bubble up from local or state governments. It's not very possible or not very probable for us to have a nationally coordinated energy policy until after a stimulus, after the stimulating event. Our institutions are slow, especially in the United States. They are slow and they are deliberative, and they were set up that way on purpose. Madison got exactly what he wanted in a lot of ways. Government in the United States is slow. In fact, I heard somebody use earlier discussing, they mentioned that we're a cruise ship, and I use this metaphor in my class quite a bit, that American policy and American politics itself is very much like that cruise ship. And we've all seen the Titanic, right? I mean, you saw the movie. You see the iceberg way out there, maybe a little bit late. You throw the wheel hard over, you get a little crack in your hull, and things go badly. Compare that to other systems around the world, where you have parliamentary democracies that are very, very much, I use the metaphor in my classes, they're speedboats. They're reactive. They can address problems much more quickly in policy solutions. Now, I'm not saying that we need to change our institutions, but we need to be, and that's very unlikely, obviously. They're called institutions for a reason. But we do need to be cognizant of the idea that that this constrained environment that we're facing with regard to resources leads us to look to innovations in our federal system based on local strengths. And if you look at renewable portfolio standards, if you look at any sort of centralized control of resources or proposed control of resources, you end up looking at this local phenomena based on the local strengths. I come from Colorado. We have a lovely class 4 and class 5 winds. We have a nice bit of coal. We've got a decent amount of hydro. You know, it's not so bad. I think there's actually a clause in the Constitution of the state of Georgia that says if anybody ever finds an ounce of coal, that they get 1,000 acres of state land or something like that. They have nothing. And if any of you are from Georgia, I don't mean to offend, but they have very little to offer other than a biofuel something. So each one of these policy standards bubble up, but they're also in these constrained environments politically, based on what culture and what politicians get elected. So there's a lot going on there. Another thing that struck me today was that these problems that we're talking about, and this is something we see a lot on the oil drum every day, is that so many disciplines, so many academic pieces of this can be brought to bear. I mean, we talked about today, and I tried to keep a list, political science from a geopolitical perspective. Of course, that's what I think about because that's what I do. But mining, economics, geology, sociology, psychology, marketing. You could take that conversation and go down any single one of those disciplines and think about how it relates to peak oil. And when you start thinking about bringing social psychology to bear, when you start thinking about individual attitudes and behavior and how people react to the idea of constraint, or how people think about going backwards. That's what I do in some of my research. I do a lot of research, prior to my cognizance of peak oil. I'm actually an elections and parties guy. And in most of my research before I got tenure, that's what I did. And so I have this kind of social science background of thinking about individuals and how they fit into all of this. But I also understand how individuals and groups and other aggregations of public will filter up into political outcomes and policy outcomes. And I'll tell you, I want to believe that if the more we have this conversation, the more we facilitate the conversations between smart people, like what we have today, like what we did yesterday, the more people who have different assumptions about the world, you sit economists down, you sit geologists down, and you make them talk. You make them say and learn about each other's assumptions. You have them understand and attempt to have a conversation about what's prudent. And that's what I like to think we're doing, and what ASPO is doing, and what a lot of these groups who see this cause as vitally important, the cause, in that we're facilitating the conversations between people with different knowledge bases. We're bringing together industry, policy, academia, understanding and challenging each other's assumptions and ideas, because that's what we have to do. Another thing that struck me, and I'll finish on this, and we can talk a little bit if you want. Why are Cassandras reviled? Why? Why? Somebody yell, why?
Why?
No, not one. They don't want to hear the bad news. Okay? How many Cassandras are there in this room? How many proud Cassandras are there in this room? There we go. The point becomes that, and another class that I teach often is a class on political parties and social movements. And obviously, political parties are an inherent part of the process. But what I've seen, not just here, but what I see on the oil drum, what I see throughout this community, and it is a community, and that's a very important part that often gets lost, is that this is a lot like a social movement. This, you can compare, if you think back to women's rights, if you think back to African Americans gaining equal rights and equal vote, if you think about processes over time where there has been some sort of macro social problem, which is what we're facing, and how that's been dealt with, and how those policies have been made and changed, well, it's a social movement. And what do we know about social movements? They're slow until they're not. We call it in political science and in public policy, we call it punctuated equilibrium. Meaning you make a little bit of progress, something happens, you make a little bit of progress in your policy, and then you wait a little while for another opportunity to come along, and you make a little, and it's just this kind of slow, secular slog. Most of the time, social movements are local. They're grassroots. That's what you all are, in a lot of ways. You are elites, but you're also grassroots, in a lot of it. And that's the interesting part of this for me. Is because the mind capacity that it takes to understand this is amazing. To be able to integrate all of this stuff. And I'd like to think I'm relatively smart. But every time I think I've got a handle on it, it's just like squeezing sand. It just goes right through your fingers. You think you thought about that little path that's going to go that way? Nah. Then something else comes along. And that's obviously the problem of predicting the future. Social movements are also beyond politics, but they're inherently political. We talked a lot today about mechanisms and policy options. When we start thinking about command and control, when we start talking about subsidies, when we start talking about incentive programs, all of those require leadership, policy entrepreneurship, ideas. That's your job. That's what you're going to go out of here and do, hopefully. You're going to talk to others, which leads me to my final point. This community is about activism. It's about persuasion. And it's about information. How we give that information, the many forms, the many outlets in which we exchange that information and those ideas, whether it's on the web, whether it's in a conference setting, whether it's on TV, whether it's through an email to your grandma. There's some way to show people and get people thinking about this. And this is a small group in a large world. You're also some of the smartest, long-term, paradigmatic, systemic thinkers. And explaining this to people who are not, that's tough. And I don't have some sort of nice canned message that you can deliver from a marketing standpoint other than saying peak oil is bad. That doesn't work. I've tried it. At the end of the day, all you can do is hope to deliver information, facilitate conversations between smart people, and keep having those conversations. And I'll finish up with this. And this is on the oil drum, we've got that little quote box in the top left corner, and this is one of them. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. That's Gandhi. Have a lovely day.